afternoon, everyone. We'll get through this so we can get going out of here. As Mark said, John Crowley is my name. I'm with a company called AbacusBio. And we'll talk a bit today about updates to the American Angus dollar value indexes, the economic selection indexes there. It's always good to just give a little bit of background to who and what AbacusBio is and how we get involved in projects like this. It kind of helps us get a handle on how we go about this work. Essentially, AbacusBio is a consultancy or a contract research organization. Agricultural science and economics, our favorite science and our core capability would be breeding and genetics. So we get involved in projects around the world with regards breeding objectives, genetic evaluation developments, new trait developments, breeding objectives and assigned matings, etc., etc. So a lot of geneticists, a lot of economists under the one house, a lot of other ag scientists as well that look at impact analysis type of stuff. But four offices: New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and the UK. I'm based in Canada. So that's just a little bit of background about us. And now a little bit of background about those dollar values. A lot of people in the room will be familiar with what they are. They've been presented at BIF before. A lot of people use them. They depend on them. One of the lead creators, Dr. Jason Archer, that spoke to before me, he did a lot of this work back in 2019 and 2020 for us. So a lot of this background is based on work that he would have led. The dollar value indexes, again, you're all familiar with them, but a suite of economic selection indexes created from bioeconomic models and survey methods. So a lot of the economically relevant traits to beef production at a commercial level would get weighted based on economic preference. We also use survey methods inside in this as well for a few different reasons. So whether there's producers, packers, feedlots that have influence on how genetic selection would materialize, we get their opinions on what trait priorities are for the industry also. And that's important with regard to the motivation of some of these updates I'm going to talk about. Presented back in 2019, 2020 at BIF, that's just a screen grab of what those slides were at the time. At the time, it was new dollar value indexes at the American Angus Association. A lot of what I'm going to talk about today is updates to dollar M, so the maternal index. So dollar M and dollar B are up there. You can see a few of the traits either in the slide below to the right or in the table to the left of what is inside in those traits and what goes into the summation to an index. And then dollar C is a combined index of dollar B and dollar B being dollar beef and dollar M. So they are all important because they actually get influenced about these updates that I'm going to talk about. We didn't do any survey methods for this round of improvements or updates. We took a lot of the survey feedback from previous times. And again, what that survey feedback does is helps us reaffirm what the bioeconomic model is showing us, maybe helping us tweak the bioeconomic model from what we're realizing based on some preferences that we see at an economic level, but actually a survey or even subjective feedback would say a trait should be more important than we're realizing, and also to discover new preferences that we might not know about. And one quick little bullet point that popped up there with regards to the updates that we'll be going through here is when we think about heifer pregnancy. When we modeled that previously, there was an element of what's the return, what's the cost and revenue associated with heifer pregnancy, but also what that means for the cow later on in life. So there was a survival and a subsequent later in life economic value correlated back into that heifer pregnancy value. So the main updates that I'll go through today, as I said, are on the dollar M side of things, the maternally focused index estimating profitability differences between progeny. And I'll go through three of those updates. It'll be the inclusion of functional longevity, a new trait, inclusion of teat and other newly developed EPDs, newly developed traits for the Angus Association for AGI, and an update on then of how we tackle heifer pregnancy. As I said, there was a heifer pregnancy element to, or there was a stability or survivability element to heifer pregnancy or before that. So we need to just have a rethink on how we go about that. Again, this is another slide from back in the 2019, 2020 presentations. Steve Miller and Jason presented this. So again, a screen grab of those slides, but it is important to look at the motivation for what I'm talking about today. A little pointer here, maybe. This is the road that I'm going to just use as motivation, and this little bullet point here. So this is feedback from commercial cow-calf guys on what they find important and what they would select for on their ranch. And number one, smaller ranks are higher importance. So number one was cow survival. So moving on, taking that and seeing what are the EPDs, what are the economically relevant traits that Angus producers and buyers have to select on and put selection pressure on. There wasn't anything directly available for that. So post 2020, the Angus Association took that and started developing this trait in earnest. And today we have functional longevity as EPD, as an EPD. I'm not going to go into the nuts and bolts of functional longevity. It's been presented a few different times. Andre presented it last year at BIF. Title slide is there. American Angus Association's functional longevity EPD. There's a QR code there if you want to go straight to that paper. I hope that's the right QR code. It's either that or it's a link to Oilers Panthers link for tomorrow night. Go Oilers! I'm up in Edmonton, so we get that in there. And so looking at trends, Andre presented all this last year. What the EPD is, what the definition is, how they came to what it is, and Mark is checking that, or yeah, you are checking that QR code is right. It's not John. So the unit of dysfunctional longevity. So then when we start developing an economic weight or an economic value for these traits, the unit of the trait is fiercely important. So the number of calves by 6 years of age is what dysfunctional longevity EPD is. Again, it's a trait that would capture a lot of the macro fertility expressions in a female. She exists in the herd year on year on year. That's what you're getting at. It doesn't really, it's kind of agnostic to why she's there, but it's a general trait that gets a female longevity. The functional piece is quite important. The fact that she does stay in the herd plus has all those calves up until that year of age. And again, Andre went through why that year of age is important. There's a whole random regression, multi-trait evaluation around that. And at 6 years of age is the preferential age to select for. So when we think about functional longevity and we think about going ahead, modeling this and getting an economic value and a subsequent weighting on it to include it in the maternal indexes, there's two real components that we need to think about. It's the survival piece, the costs and revenues of a cow surviving for longer than her contemporaries. And there's also the direct revenue piece, the fact that it's, again, the functional piece, the fact that you do have that calf that you're able to recognize revenue on. So there are two pieces that you end up modeling a little bit separately, but they obviously come together to form the whole economic value of this trait. When we go ahead and model this and you start stepping through how things play out on a commercial operation with regards to survival year on year, number of placements retained, if survival is too low, then you need to probably buy replacements. So there's what emerges is kind of two levels of there's probably a spectrum of management levels, but what emerges is two levels of management really. It's that more intensive management style and there's a low management style. And they're the two that we ended up modeling to get some type of blended average to see what does functional longevity matter to a commercial producer. We kind of hit a fork in the road, and I'll talk a little bit about that as we go ahead. So I'll just step through that more in the thinking behind those two divergent type of scenarios. The more intensive managed herd, just to have a think about that for a second. This is the type of herd where culls are detected early, pregnancies or empties are detected early, easy access to replacements within a season. So because of all this, the number of cows within this herd would stay near equilibrium in absence of a herd expansion or a herd contraction scenario for other reasons other than bad fertility. right? So you can imagine that type of herd recognizes empties, can get rid of them pretty quick, can bring in some replacement heifers that they probably have or they were going to sell. So the survival culling doesn't greatly influence the number of calves produced here. So earlier on, there's a survival economic cost component to this, and there's a loss of revenue cost component to this. In this highly managed herd, they don't actually suffer too much from that loss of revenue because they're able to get those empties in, or those empties replaced. So the main economic effects of functional longevity in this scenario would be replacement costs and cull cow revenues to offset some of those replacement costs. There's a big model around this. I just thought it'd be useful to pace out a few of the main considerations or a few of the example inputs, costs and revenues considered. It would be things like the probability of surviving year on year. So we have a look at what a survival or a herd profile looks like. So you've got X percentage of cows in their first parity, X minus something in your second parity, X minus something else in your third parity, and so on, so on. So that's a herd profile is kind of a backbone to this. And what you end up doing is you model what the economics of a herd like that is, and how many calves you get out of it, and how many replacements are needed. And then you model it again and change that survival by 1 unit, or change functional longevity by 1 unit. And that's your definition of an economic value. What is the economic weight or the economic value you'll be able to place on 1 unit of increase of that trait in a commercial setting? So replacement costs, cull cow costs, wean calf costs, they all come into it. Then we think about the lowly managed herd. This is a type of herd where there's a more fluctuating scenario. Missing detecting those culls or missing detecting those empties will lead to a failure to be able to replace those within any one season. So then the main economic effect on longevity there, or functional longevity there, is the loss in profit of that calf, as well as the other costs associated with needing to replace those culls. So then we go into some combined scenarios. Well, which proportion of which? So after some searching around, consultation with different people, you end up, well, actually most of the herds are managed at the good side of things, or the intensive. Intensive is kind of a bad word because it implies high cost, but I think we know what I'm trying to. We searched around, some of my colleagues, as I gave my thoughts in this presentation before I left the office. They were like, oh, don't use intensive, don't use high management because you think high cost. But you know what I mean? It's more of a hands-on, more of a, I won't use too many adjectives because I'll get myself in trouble. But you know what I'm trying to describe. So it's kind of 80% around that. We were playing around with numbers, more intensively managed, and 20% low. And then what also came out of this is I won't present the actual economic values. They're still a bit tentative with regards what they'll turn out to be. There's still a bit of final modeling to be done in this. But essentially, the economic value for functional longevity was 10 times higher in that low herd. It actually cost that low herd, lowly managed herd, a lot more than it does in that high herd, where they can bring in replacements a bit quicker and they don't actually have a loss of calf within a season. So that was functional longevity. That's going into $M. Teat and others going into $M. New EPDs based on the BIF guidelines, scores into the associations, genetic evaluation developed for those, teat size, other suspension, higher being better, based on the BIF guidelines. When we looked at this data and we started going about the costs and revenues of this data, we looked at the data coming in first, and there was evidence to show that producers seem to score this as kind of a system, like a memory system, rather. They do score it differently and note it differently. And there is differences in slight differences between contemporary groups in some averages. But all in all, the population means and variances or standard deviations were very similar. So producers are kind of scoring this as a system. And then when you think about the costs associated with bad mammary system or bad teat and udder, they're very similar as well. It's what's, I'll show it on the next table actually. If you go down to the table, what's the probability of mastitis with bad teats or bad udder? Well, it depends on which. The probability is probably pretty even. Probability of calf mortality, lack of suckling, calf morbidity a bit later in life, that the costs of what that are, the probability of having to cull this cow a little bit younger. So we put these together really. And then it's a scale, continuous scale. The averages are up about 6.5, and you end up seeing that actually there's not many below in the ones and twos at all. And actually that's where most of your costs occur. So while it's a linear scale, the costs and revenues of it, there's no revenues, it's mainly a costing. The costs are not linear. Essentially, the probabilities of an incidence of mastitis or incidence of morbidity or an incidence of lack of suckling are a lot higher or lower in the scale than it is higher in the scale. So it's you draw a distribution around this, you discretify the scale a little bit, kind of do a 1 to 3 and then a 4 and 5. You got to play around with those numbers a little bit, and you get that distribution. And essentially, what you want to do is you want to get the economic value of moving that population by one, but moving that population out of those high cost categories, and that's where you get your economic value from. And then the heifer pregnancy one. So in the original, the 2019-2020 work, there was a direct heifer pregnancy EPD, but there was also a cognizance of later in life fertility. So we used a correlation between heifer pregnancy and cow pregnancy to genetically regress some of the weighting we know about heifer preg and get some cow preg and subsequent survival economic values back onto heifer pregnancy. Basically because there wasn't a direct cow pregnancy or cow longevity trait at the time, and that's when they started developing it, and now we're revisiting it. Heifer preg, the probability of pregnancy as a heifer during a normal breeding season. Heifer preg is based on, fewer replacement needs, higher heifer preg, fewer replacements needed, and a revenue from the surplus heifers you have. Cows, less culls, and associated costs with culling. That's what all would have went into the heifer preg. But we kind of have to break some of that out now because some of those economic considerations are going into functional longevity. So we model them separately also because there's different timing of these expressions. So heifer pregnancy expresses itself once in its life by definition of the trait. Cow pregnancy has the opportunity at least to be expressed multiple times over multiple parities. So even though a trait might have a similar economic value, or let's say you have a economic value for heifer pregnancy and cow pregnancy of X and Y, you actually have a scalar for that X and a scalar for that Y based on how many times that trait is expressed over time. So inside this heifer preg, you need to be considerate of heifer age at the first mating, heifer preg rate, the correlations between those pregnancy rates at different times of life, and the asterisk there just signifies some of the updates to various components and some changes in genetic valuation that we needed to be cognizant of when we were modeling this trait. So they're not massive updates, but they were updates as we had the hood lifted. We might as well top up the washer fluid, I guess. So how are we doing for time? We're okay. Yeah. So index testing then. So we get those economic values, weight them by the right amount of genetic expressions per lifetime. Functional longevity, by the definition of the trait, is expressed once per life, really, because the definition of the trait is the number of calves by 6 years of age. So you then get economic weights. You put the economic, it's a sum product of the economic weights and the EPDs to sum to an economic selection index. I left that out. That was, I think we know that piece. So on the x-axis is the $M up until this year. And on the y-axis, it's that $M just with those little asterisks done. A few little updates to economic assumptions here and there. Nothing massive like inclusions of new traits. So just an update of the little bits of the index, you get a correlation of 0.99. It drops the average drops a little bit just because I should have a better answer, but there's probably some higher cost inside there that we recognize when we do a 5-year sliding window. Those differences in means can be easily adjusted when traits are published. But this is more kind of where we wanted to see, well, what happens when we do include these new traits into $M? Again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to create dispersion across how sires are ranked. You're not trying to, you end up uncovering more potential value. You're uncovering more of you're scratching off more of what we need to know. But it's not actually about adding another component and increasing value. It's more about creating that dispersion between sires and making sure that ranking is a little bit more accurate. So the blue cloud there is probably what we're interested in. It's the correlation between the current $M and what $M is with teeth and udder and functional longevity and all the changes that we've done. So correlation between 0.93, quite a sensible correlation when you think about what's been added. Not too much to upscuttle the whole apple cart, but enough to say, right, we've actually got some re-ranking going on here that we're getting because there's a new trait, there's a new suite of traits where they're more aligned with commercial production that we didn't have before. So actually we're uncovering that some sires, even they might have been equal or they might have been just one above each other. They actually now re-rank a little bit because we never had those EPDs before. The index testing then, this is a previous slide. So $C also, we were interested in that. $C, as I said at the start, made up of $M and $B. $B is a little bit more of a component inside in $C, so that's why the 0.93 materializes at 0.99 inside in $C. So not a whole pile of re-ranking there, but again, a little bit enough to say that we're actually capturing some new variation inside in and I keep saying sires, but again, selection candidates or whoever's on the ground when you're concerned with genetic merit. $B, $F, $G had little updates to variance components and costs inside in there, and they were all pretty similar. Some of the values, the average values changed, but again, that won't look like a blip when you look at trends over time. It just because some of the costs and revenues change, they'll be readjusted. But the rank correlation is what we're more concerned with, and there wasn't really a huge amount of re-ranking there either. But again, enough to say that we're bringing all the assumptions and all the results of this up to date. Some people have interested in this result, others don't. But when some groups are maybe selling bulls or breeding bulls, and they want to have as much of a horse for all courses type of animal, they do look at, well, what's the correlation now between the indexes? Am I now a more maternal type herd, or am I still able to sell my bulls to multiple end users? So that's why people will be interested in this for other reasons as well. Index correlations between the old $M and the new $M plus everything new $C and older $C. You could compare left and right, really. That's just a square, obviously. Not much of a difference falls from 1 to 0.93. With $M, with $B, not a huge difference in the correlation, not a huge difference with $C either, but changes nonetheless. Probably falls away with the feedlot, so the maternal and the feedlot index, which you could think about the traits. There are probably a lot of different types of traits inside there, maybe only a little overlap. So you could concede to, okay, yeah, that correlation's falling away a bit. We're having a bit more concentration on female fertility, and I don't know, you could postulate that, okay, energy in the system of an animal is going a little bit more towards keeping her healthier, keeping her reproductive, and dragging a little bit of energy from the growth and just taking care of herself a bit better. So I think that's fine. Same with $C. Not much changes in the correlations between the older version and the newer version, so they all stay pretty stable. So I think I have 2 more slides before I do a conclusion slide. And this slide and the next slide is the same thing as just the graph split up. This is what a 10-year response to selection would look like based on $M dollar M with the small tweaks, and dollar M with the whole thing. So there's the little legend up there. You'll see a fourth bar here that doesn't matter. It was a test bar, but I couldn't take it out of this graph. I was a bit too late to redo the data, to be honest. So for the sake of this presentation, what we'll concern ourselves with is the dark orange bar and the dark green bar. That's really what we want to see. And these would be responses. How does responses in a movement in dollar M materialize in the EPDs that are listed down in the x-axis here? So we've calving ease, birth weight, weaning weight, along some of them more relevant than others. The ones, so, and these are expressed in standardized responses, trait per trait, standard deviation. So on the y-axis, you'll see we're at 0 in the middle and goes +1, -1. So inside there, you'll see strong responses to $M generally. Forget about between the bars. You'll see strong responses to $M in calving ease, in birth weight, in heifer preg, obviously because it's in there now, and milk and mature weight. So if we take those on and see how the dark orange and the dark green differ, so that's the current $M and the new proposed $M. Do they change a lot? Calving ease doesn't a little bit. We get a bit more response to calving ease. Birth weight a little bit better, or it depends on how you look at it. If you keep going along there, heifer pregnancy, that's inside there now, updated. So you get a pretty similar response to selection on heifer pregnancy, and same with milk and mature weight. So nothing hugely changes there. Little tweaks. Some traits are borrowing from others just based on the correlations between the traits. You'll see there I was going to say Manhattan Tower, but not to confuse it with genomics. So the big tall one there in the middle is functional longevity. If we just zone in on that for a second, you can see the dark orange. Before functional longevity was even in the index, it was still having a response to selection just because of correlations with the other traits that are inside there. Now that it's inside in the trait, so this is about 10 years of response to selection. So that's assuming, probably 0.1 standard deviation per year movement in this index. So we can just use 10-year response as kind of a way to think about it. So now the functional longevity is in there, you get a much greater response. You get nearly a twofold increase in the response if the index starts to move at the same rate per year. Again, because it's in there directly, it wasn't in there before, but just because of the correlation with the maternal-esque traits inside there anyway, it was getting benefit. Maybe borrowing a little bit from docility there at the start, not a huge drop off, and you can see there at the end, not that it's overly relevant, but your eyes are drawn to little drop offs in the carcass traits there at the end. But fat stays where it is. Again, you could postulate that it's the energetics of the system getting reapportioned. So that's kind of all I had to go through. It was more of a methods and some results type of presentation. I thought it'd be quite worth it, especially with the title of this session. These indexes all have to do with improving economic efficiency of the system. So concluding on what I presented, functional longevity as a newly developed trait inside in the dollar indexes adds to capturing more of available genetic merit that's there and highlighting it. It adds points of difference to the sires or the selection candidates, and increases the dispersion of those values a little bit. And those, the whole aim is to rank those animals more accurately. The other little pieces that we did, just firming up the whole thing, adding a few bits and pieces kind of to reflect today's economics, but don't reflect rankings too much, but enough to say that we're keeping things moving. And these inputs and assumptions are going to be updated regularly, and reviewed continuously. So I mentioned earlier on, these are close to final results, so I could have presented a little bit more on them with regards to actual values, but they're not exactly finalized. And not that they matter a whole pile anyway. It's more about, well, what's the emphasis, what's the response, what's the correlation, what changes that we need to be cognizant of. So I'm presenting this today, but there's actually a huge team behind this. All the Angus and AGI crew, Kelly, Andre, and Pedro. Steve Miller was involved in this, who's down in Australia now, and Cheryl and myself, Tiago and Natalie at Abacus.